The Northern Soul phenomenon was the most exciting underground British club movement of the 1970s. In its heyday, white working-class youth in the north of England travelled hundreds of miles across the region to dance to obscure black American soul records until the break of dawn.
You had a purpose in life. You know, you're always looking to hear that next record. You're always like, you know, looking forward to the buzz of the weekend.
It was just excitement. It was just euphoria.
Everybody was there for one reason only, and that was the music. Nothing else mattered.
With its roots in mod culture of the previous decade, Northern Soul created a genuine antidote to desperate, dead-end times.
Everybody worked in a factory. Everybody worked at the pit. I didn't know anybody who worked in offices.
You know, you've got one night a week and you're going to just do everything that you wanted to do all week in that one night.
It became a way of life, with its own completely unique fashions and dance styles.
If you went to a club and saw someone do a big high kick, you would try and outkick that person by kicking higher.
Northern Soul DJs believed they were creating a radical alternative to mainstream British culture.
We found our own records in defiance of the market, in defiance of Radio 1, in defiance of the newspapers, in defiance of the media, and in great defiance of Top of the Pops.
But the joyful unity between the northern clubs was shattered by bitter infighting.
When the rivalries were very intense, there's no two ways about that. They talk about the north-south split. This was a north-north split.
Today, in the 21st century, Northern Soul is being discovered by a brand new generation and experiencing a glorious revival. But it was back in the 70s that a strange, exotic flower pushed its way up through the concrete of northern England and changed people's lives.
Late 50s, the Midlands and the North were grim. We still worked 44 hours a week. A Saturday morning was part of our working week. Working men's clubs would have been the predominant form of entertainment.
Grimy, smoky, no glamour whatsoever.
The older generation, my parents would go to bingo or the local Liberal club for a comedian and the turn. That was people's entertainment.
There was no club scene in the early 1960s in the north of England. There were ballrooms where live bands usually played and people went and danced. There were covers bands that played in halls and not very much else.
But down south, a budding youth movement that would later inspire the Northern Soul scene was emerging in the twilight world of London's Soho and West End.
The birth of club culture began, I guess, with the mods or the modernists, the kids who gave you a glimpse of the future. They were looking for something new and different. They didn't want to listen to the music of their parents.
And they wanted to hear originally modern jazz, but then it moved on to blue beat and R&B. And what they wanted to hear were the original records.
It was at underground venues like the Flamingo in Soho where these sharp-dressed mods danced to black American soul records all night until the break of dawn. They were also falling in love with the exciting new sounds of Motown, a Detroit-based label whose soul releases were now dominating the American charts.
It was, I love you, darling, you hurt me, I hurt you, let's get back together, with a thumping great beat and a bloody great chorus to sing along to.
It was refreshing. If nowadays you look at the lyrics, they were very sad. But it had that uptown beat.
It's got a do-do-do-do-do sort of beat to it, but it's got those lovely chords. So a new music form was found with a rock beat and jazz chords. because the chords uplift your mood and make you feel happy or wistful on a rock beat. That's the Motown sound.
The Motown sound was hugely popular in the USA and very widely imitated. But in the UK, apart from the occasional chart hit, its artists initially struggled to gain anything like their stateside success.
Radio 1 didn't start broadcasting until 1967, so all through the heyday of Tamla Motown, there wasn't a proper station for young people. In those days, you really had to go to record stores or tune into pirate stations to hear black American music.
So when the pirate radio ships came along, we were given a lot of freedom to play the music we liked. I made sure that I wanted to play black soul music.
People do forget, now that music is ubiquitous in our society, it was the opposite in the 1960s. It didn't fall on your lap. It wasn't something that accompanied TV adverts. It was something that you had to go and seek out.
By the mid-1960s, London's mod culture, with its love of dancing all night to little-known soul records, was infiltrating the north.
The mod had the Flamingo and other clubs, and it slowly transferred north. So it'd work its way up the country by people from, say, Market Harborough or Leicester or Doncaster. One or two people from that town catching the train to London and bringing something back.
A crucial destination in the north was Manchester's Twisted Wheel. This club was a rare oasis for mods in the region. A young Pete Waterman stumbled across the Twisted Wheel when visiting the city for a football match.
It was one of those things when you went, oh my God, what is this? This is amazing. You know, I was hearing stuff that I'd never heard before, but I knew what it was. And I remember catching the train the next day, and I must have been very quiet all the way back thinking, where do I go and get them records?
Across the Peak District in Sheffield, promoter and DJ Peter Stringfellow was creating a similar all-nighter at the Mojo Club.
Every Saturday night, that was it. The whole neighbourhood was boom, 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 boom. And they would stay until 10 o'clock Sunday morning. They were taking these things called blueies, and off they would go. And I think there was a wild one called the Black Bomber, which would keep you dancing for a week.
It was these small underground venues like Sheffield's Mojo and Manchester's Twisted Wheel, with their culture of dancing all night to black music, that were now sowing the seeds of what would become Northern Soul. Down south, pop culture was changing at an increasingly dramatic pace. 1967 was the year that psychedelic rock exploded, but it wasn't embraced by everyone.
The reason psychedelia didn't work in the north is because it was too industrial. There's just no way that you could tune in and drop out in the north when on a Monday you've got to go and work in the steelworks in Scunthorpe. What they needed was an escape for the weekend.
Peter Stringfellow attempted to introduce psychedelia into the underground soul clubs of the north.
It was 1967. I was wearing a caftan and flowers. I walked on stage and I was playing my kind of flower power music. If you ever go to San Francisco, and I'm throwing flowers, and they were throwing Pepsi-Cola bottles back at me. Get off! String, what are you doing, String? Get off, it's rubbish.
As Stringfellow discovered, the mods in the north did not want to change.
They weren't interested in Jefferson Airplane. They wanted to continue taking amphetamines and dancing to R&B music. And the amphetamines had an effect of the music speeding up. Anyone on amphetamines tends to be talking 10 to the dozen, and likewise with the music became faster and faster.
It was these up-tempo soul stompers with their non-stop 4/4 beat that created the blueprint for Northern Soul. I Can't Help Myself by Motown act The Four Tops epitomised this style.
You know that I love you.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
'Cause I love you.
All the way through. Doesn't let up. That's all it is. It is absolutely, the beat is not complicated. There's no swing elements. There is no... None of that. There's no swing elements. There's no time signature changes. This is just a straight beat.
I can't help myself. No, I cannot help myself.
It's important because it's almost a template for what became Northern Soul. It has the yearning vocal, it has the beautiful orchestration, and it has the snare on every beat.
And I kissed it 1,000 times. Sugar pie, honey buns, sugar pie. You know that I'm weak for you.
Then you get to the chorus, I can't help myself, I love you and nobody else. It's just everybody sings along because everybody understands the message. And everybody's bouncing about to a beat singing a sad song. It's brilliant.
And that became the kind of signifier of every great Northern Soul stomper. So the really up-tempo records that were known in the Northern Soul scene were pretty much all based on that kind of sound. The Four Tops, I Can't Help Myself.
Nobody else.
But as these up-tempo tracks became the records of choice at the budding Northern Soul clubs, times and music were changing in Black America.
Some people say we got a lot of malice, some say it's a lot of nerve.
This time, you know, there was the riots in Watts, there was protests at the '68 Olympics, the assassination of Martin Luther King. There were people who became radicalized, there were black GIs coming back from Vietnam with a new militancy.
Brother, we can't quit.
As the slower, tougher, more political James Brown funk began to dominate the Black American landscape, the faster, optimistic mid-60s Motown sound was now out of date. But soul fans in the north of England didn't like what they heard.
Musically, it was too off the wall and it was too slow to be consumed by 500 kids in a basement off their heads on French blues. They wanted something quicker, something faster, and funk wasn't it.
If the clubs in the north of England wanted to keep playing uplifting, up-tempo soul, they were now forced to look back into the past, sourcing their records from this mid-60s golden era of Motown, whose sound had been widely imitated across Black America.
Northern Soul started out as us looking for records with the Motown sound that weren't on Motown. And the more they had flopped, the more they were a B-side that no one had ever seen before, the more desirable they became. So we went looking for flops or B-sides of obscure records that no one had ever heard of.
On one hand, you got the highly polished, industrialized music machine like Motown, but lower down the food chain, you know, there were these little artists in the back of nowhere, so badly recorded. Most of them are little more than demos. But what appeals is the honesty and the integrity and the truth. I guess that's what people love about them.
At the end of the decade, clubs like Manchester's Twisted Wheel were mining this mid-60s period for forgotten soul records and playing them at their all-nighters for the very first time.
I would say the landmark record for the Twisted Wheel would be a record by Leon Haywood called Baby Reconsider. That was the tip of the iceberg for what we were then to see over the next 4 or 5 years, an absolute landslide of amazing American imports.
When you had a record like Baby Reconsider, everybody wanted to dance to. Everybody. There was no other club in England you could hear it, so they had to travel to the Wheel to hear this music.
Ian Levine, from an affluent Blackpool family, was just a teenager when he had his very first Twisted Wheel experience.
was in a stone cellar painted black with wheels on the wall, and the heat hit you. Because people smoked in the club, the nicotine and sweat was dripping off the ceiling, literally like stalactites of brown-coloured gunge. And everybody was on that floor clapping on the beat. Dun, 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 dun. Not like some bunch of mum and dads at a wedding, but so sharply clapping to every beat. That was Northern Soul. Bob Brain and the Concords, More of Your Love, at the Twisted Wheel. That was it. There was no going back from that point.
Other clubs in the north, inspired by the Twisted Wheel, were setting up their own high-octane soul all-nighters.
When we were going to the all-nighters, it was a special club. You could leave Huddersfield, and on the train, you get the people from Leedsgate on, the girls from Dewsbury. We'd get on Huddersfield. You just knew people that would be on the train. We're all part of the same group. We're going to the same club.
Here we had underground American black music taking over and producing the culture that became Northern Soul. Although at this time, nobody called it Northern Soul. It was just excitement.
But this was about to change.
It needed some sort of tag to identify it. The story goes that Dave Godin, who had a record shop in London called Soul City Records, on a weekend, people from the north, maybe in town to watch Manchester United at West Ham, who knows, would take the time to go into his shop and ask for a certain type of sound, I suppose, soul sound.
And of course Dave was in the middle of London, where the culture was very much James Brown, very much the funkier side of sounds, and kids from the north would go down and ask for faster records. And Dave got to understand that this was happening not just occasionally, but week in, week out, and he realised that a different thing was developing in the north of England.
Before that, we called it rare soul, up-tempo soul. People said, what, like Motown? No, like Motown, but on different labels. You couldn't describe it, but Dave, by coining it, gave it an identity.
Hey girl, don't bother me now. Hey girl, stay away, girl. Come back another day, don't bother me.
The first signs that Northern Soul was becoming something more than a localised phenomenon was when certain old records began to be re-released and revived and to get into the charts. One is the Tams, Hey Girl Don't Bother Me.
They said you like to cheat.
Tony Blackburn had championed Hey Girl Don't Bother Me on the pirate radio stations back in the mid-60s when the record was originally released.
I can normally spot in those days a hit record, and I thought that one's going to be a really big hit, and it wasn't. It didn't make it. And it must have been about 6 or 7 years later, because of the Northern Soul scene, they suddenly discovered it up there and started playing it, and it actually forced it to becoming a #1 hit.
To the Tams' great surprise, they were invited over from America to perform their old song on Top of the Pops. But in 1971, the same year the Tams hit the top of the charts, Manchester's Twisted Wheel, the mother club of the emerging Northern Soul scene, was in trouble.
The drug squad became very aware of what was going on. The usual thing that would be levied against a venue like the Twisted Wheel would be it's a haven for people taking drugs, which of course really, whilst it was true, it wasn't the reason people were going there in the first place.
Manchester City Council was putting pressure on that there would be no more all-night dances within the city of Manchester. There was only one that I knew of, and that was the Twisted Wheel. So the police gunned for it, council gunned for it, so they closed it. And I thought, when that finished, then that was it. It was over. The good times had gone.
The north of the Midlands was bleak. It was tough in the late 50s, but by the early 70s, it had gone into serious depression. We'd had strikes in the car industry, we'd had strikes in the pits. The North was being hung out to dry, there's no question. There were so many unemployed or people that couldn't make their living the way they'd made their living before. There was gloom and despondency all around.
So many patches of like waste ground because a lot of the mills were being knocked down at that time. And as kids, we all used to play on the waste ground.
I couldn't see any way of breaking out of the town I lived in. Everybody worked in a factory. Everybody worked at the pit. I didn't know anybody who worked in offices. Everybody seemed to be leaving school at 15.
When I was at school, I was asked, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to work for a record company. You know, this is like 15 years old in Mirfield, and they're like, we don't have many record companies in Mirfield, but you can work at the cement factory.
But I think the Northern Soul thing in that early period was the only hope that anybody had up north of getting out of it.
Ooh, girl, be my sweet darling.
It was on a quiet street in the town of Tunstall, close to its traditional pubs, that the underground spirit of Northern Soul was revived. Although the torch had been operating for a number of years, in 1972, this club started its very first Northern Soul all-nighter.
It was strange because it was in an odd place. It was in Tunstall, Stoke-on-Trent. I mean, we'd have to get a train to Derby and then Derby to Crewe and jump off at Longport railway station and walk a mile up the hill. And it was a residential street.
You turned into Hoe Street in the queue, and this was a built-up terraced house residential area. You would hear the bump, bump, bump of the sound of the torch. And that's what it was. It was almost like the building was shaking and shaking everything else around it. The magic as you turned into the street was just phenomenal, and then you just couldn't wait to get inside the club.
The Golden Torch for me was everything because it was my first ever all-nighter. We were young and we've decided that we did not want to know the charts by this time. You know, there was another chart, our chart, and we wanted, whilst in 1972 it might have been Slade and Little Willie by The Sweet, we wanted Duke Browner Crying Over You and Nolan Chance Just Like the Weather. They were our top sounds. That was our top 20.
In just over a year, the torch helped reunify the underground Northern Soul scene. But it was in a town 50 miles away where this growing movement would be absolutely transformed. Wigan was once a major manufacturing powerhouse in the north, but the town's cotton and coal industries had been in severe decline for decades. Russ Winstanley was a local Wigan DJ and soul fan.
I heard in early '73 that the all-nighters were finishing at the Torch in Stoke. So I decided to have a look round for a venue.
The Wigan Casino had been built in the early part of the 20th century.
The casino was just perfect, fabulous sprung dance floor, massive areas to it, held about 3,500 to 4,000. The very first night at Wigan Casino was frightening, it was amazing, it was incredible. And I always remember thinking, when we got over the 500 mark, September the 23rd now, 1973, if we get to Christmas, I'll be really mad.
Wigan, logistically, what a great place. Have you been to Wigan train station? It's fantastic. You can go anywhere from Wigan trains. You can get to Wigan. It's on the motorway. It was perfect. And they never looked back from then on, and it just went bigger and bigger and bigger.
In the same year the all-nighters started at the Wigan Casino, Ian Levine went on one of his regular family holidays to Miami. But rather than soaking up the sun, he spent all his time digging for old 1960s soul records in a huge, dimly lit charity store.
I would at 9 in the morning till they closed at 6, and each day I carried a cardboard box of records home. By the 9 days had finished, I'd put some.
He was there every day, going to places, finding records, that thirst for knowledge, looking at a label and instantly knowing that it could be a goer.
When we left Miami with my 4,000 records, we were on a tiny little 2-engine propeller plane to go to the Bahamas. And these 4,000 records were on board this little plane, and the pilots took off and he couldn't get any height. And he started to say, I can't get the plane up, the records, those crates are too heavy. And my dad erupted, and he said he was going to open the door of the plane and throw the great big chests of records, they were like tea chests, 4,000 of them, into the sea. And I begged him not to, I'm pleading, it's the best records I've ever found, please don't. He says, the plane can't take off.
Thankfully, Ian wasn't forced to ditch his 4,000 singles into the ocean to save his family's life.
The find of those records was the greatest significant find of the Northern Soul scene, because every big record from 73 and 74 came out of that find. The greatest haul ever.
After safely returning to his hometown of Blackpool with his huge vinyl haul, Ian Levine was now a much sought-after DJ. Colin Curtis had started a new Northern Soul night at Blackpool Mecca's Highland Room, and he invited Ian to join him as resident DJ.
That haul from Goodwill left me on a pedestal above Wigan or anybody. Nobody could compete with those records because I found so many at once. Every week I was coming up with new monster stompers that were absolute quintessential bare essence of what Northern Soul is all about.
It was easy to generate excitement in the Highland Room because of the low roof, because of the style of music, and the up-tempo music just kept that air of tension, that air of excitement up at that level, and hand clapping, spinning. It was just the whole thing was just exciting.
Still remember my heart beating as I went up the escalator to the Highland Room. One of the most exciting clubs I've ever been to in my life.
My girl, you're just too darn soulful. Oh, yeah.
As we moved into the early 70s then, you would have the Blackpool Mecca and you would have Wigan Casino as the two leading lights of Northern Soul.
A healthy rivalry developed between these two clubs, which helped fan the gospel across the region.
The people you were playing to all knew where they would go to. Are you going to go here next Saturday? I'll see you at there on Sunday. That's going on next week. There's an all-day at Whitchurch. You didn't have to advertise. Everybody knew the DJs. I remember the adverts we used to put in the mags. All we did was put the songs we were playing, because that's all everybody wanted to know. What songs is Pete Waterman playing that Colin isn't playing, or Ian isn't playing, or Russ Winstanley? And he found a record that was different.
Alongside the music, a unique visual style was emerging.
We would go to Burton's and order suits with 6 pockets, 30 buttons, wide trousers with seams in, turn-ups. Fashion and music were connected.
Very much was, you know, the baggy trousers, the brown shoes, the jacket, the shirt, the badge, keep the faith.
It was total escapism. It was nothing like what you did in the week. The experience of going to an all-nighter in a different town and meeting all these different sorts of people and having this kind of drive to like be better and better at dancing or better at collecting records was such an attractive proposition compared to what was set out for you.
It kind of propelled you through everything else. Even if you had a crap job, Monday to Friday, you could go on autopilot and just live for the weekends.
And it's dancing your tears away and dancing your pain away. You're on the dance floor dancing to a dance beat, but you're hearing this singer singing about a lost love, the pain of life, a heartbreak. I'm going to have a good time and leave all my heartbreak and all my pain behind. that bittersweet feeling of good times to escape from the bad times.
You know, you've got one night a week and you're going to just do everything that you wanted to do all week in that one night.
Strict 1970s licensing laws didn't allow alcohol at the all-nighters, but that didn't bother many of the Northern Soul clubbers.
Drugs were absolutely key. They are a part of the Northern Soul scene. That was a marriage. Speed and tempo of record, large building, 4 o'clock in the morning.
I tended to be Mr. Straight because I was a DJ, I was also driving, but it wouldn't be unusual for my car to be full of people that were speeding off their heads, and thank God one of us was straight.
Obviously, for most people, it required a prescription from the doctor, but for some Northern Soul fans, it basically just meant breaking into a chemist on the way to whichever all-nighter that they were going to, and relieving the chemist of their slimming pill supplies and then distributing them at Blackpool or Wigan or wherever it was that they were heading.
People talk about the highs you get from drugs, whether it's cocaine or whatever else you're taking, and for me, that hit was probably provided by the playing of music. If you're playing an unknown record for the first time and getting an unbelievable response, that's the biggest buzz. That's what this is all about. It's sharing music with people and getting a reaction.
The majority of Northern Soul clubbers were white working class, but some young black people were beginning to discover the scene. Fran Franklin was the child of a black American father and a white Irish mother.
School in Edinburgh in the 60s and 70s was really tough. I'd never seen any other black people other than my dad my whole life, you know, until I was like about 13. I don't think I'd ever actually seen a black person. I was bullied a lot. I had to grow up pretty quick.
You got to be good to me.
I took a lot of verbal abuse, and they used to write names on the wall outside the house and stuff, so it was pretty nasty for a while. It was a beautiful experience the first time I ever went to an all-nighter. I can always remember being at Wigan in a sea of people and floating as if I was floating on the sea in the sea of happiness. There would never be any racism. Everybody loved the music. It would be very hard for someone to be racist and be singing along to some black artists. It changed my life in that I was able to just be free of all the name calling. I was free to dance how I wanted to dance. I was embraced into a family of great people and people that knew me as Fran Franklin, not that girl with the big afro.
Northern Soul dancing brought out of more traditional northern guys something that they probably didn't know existed within themselves until that music became the catalyst.
For the first time, boys were able to just get on the floor and express themselves in a way that had never been done before. They probably felt as liberated as I did.
The male dancers on Northern Soul were like peacocks. They were wearing the best clothes and they were strutting their stuff. And they learnt their moves from watching soul singers from America. The people like Jackie Wilson particularly, he spins round, he does the backflips. And even James Brown, who had nothing to do with Northern Soul, but he still had the steps and the moves.
James Brown was doing the shuffle thing So I think the fast footwork probably did come a little bit from there, but we weren't trying to be Soul Train, we weren't trying to be anybody else, we were just doing our thing.
The northern clubs and records like Tainted Love were now uniting people across the region.
I always give credit to Richard Serling for breaking Tainted Love. It was the right record at the right time. The fact that it worked so beautifully for hand claps. The fact is we wanted fast records at the time. We were all like 16, 17, 18-year-old kids wanting to burn our energy off. If you're going to do it to a song like Tainted Love.
It's like every single person knew when that clap was going to happen, and everybody clapped at the same time. And it just made every hair in your body stand up. It just all bubbles up like in a big melting pot and explodes in your head, and you just have to throw yourself about that dance floor and just love it. Northern soul will touch your soul.
The scene in the north had developed in almost total isolation from the rest of the country. But then a southern-based record label, Pi, spotted an opportunity.
The northern scene, particularly at Wigan, was becoming so big, it was bound to attract the attention of the London-based record companies.
The record industry suddenly woke up that there was an industry north of Watford. So the Disco Demand series certainly worked for Pi, because at that point nobody in the record industry even cared.
They made popular northern tracks on the northern scene available to people like me who would never get to hear those sort of tracks. But I can remember there was fierce debate and backlash against the purists who didn't want their music to be enjoyed or exposed or bought by anybody else.
The top northern soul DJs reacted to this increasing flood of easily accessible reissues by hunting down ever more obscure records to play in the clubs.
You would have to chase down every single lead to try and find the records that you wanted. Quite often there'd be one copy and it'd be in someone's collection. You'd have to try and prize it out. You'd have to offer really good swaps to get them. But once you got that record, and you could actually say, it's the only one in the country. If you want to hear it, you've got to come to my gigs.
The Wigan Casino's record bar was instrumental in feeding the desire for rarities amongst the clubbers.
The record bar at Wigan Casino is where the record dealers swap, trade or buy these records that otherwise you wouldn't have any way of getting hold of them.
By the end of 1974, rare vinyl fever was reaching epic proportions, and record-digging trips to the States were now rife.
We found a B-side of an obscure record from Detroit that nobody had ever heard of in their life. We made it into a turntable hit. We didn't get record companies coming and saying, this is our new smash, play it. We found our own records in defiance of the market, in defiance of Radio 1, in defiance of the newspapers, in defiance of the media, and in great defiance of Top of the Pops.
Times were changing. Freddie Laker announced £59 one way to the USA. We were racing. We didn't know how long it'd last. Would our dreams be shattered by 1976? Would there be no more Northern Soul scene? Maybe these records were going to be worth 10 pence in 3 years' time. Let's find as many as we can and bring them back and sell them, enjoy them. We just live for the moment.
It's a really great year for Wigan, and in fact we have now Wigan's ovation, and we're going to go skiing in the snow.
Days are growing cold, the snows are falling up on the hill. I gotta get my gear out ready for winter chill.
I think there was a time in the 70s when the Northern Soul had been very underground, and then suddenly, I think obviously promoters saw the potential and they started recording their own records.
Skiing in the snow.
Wigan's Ovation's cover version of a rare Northern Soul song became a major top 20 chart hit in 1975.
I think Wigan's Ovation in Skin Us Now was bad for Northern Soul. Terrible cover version of the Invitations classic. That was when it was no longer underground. Everybody knew about it. I was into Bay City Rollers last year, now I'm into Northern Soul.
You'd be speaking to work colleagues, they'd say, what are you into? Say, what, Northern Soul? And they go, oh, what, like Wigan's Ovation? No. How many times do I have to explain that's as far away as it could possibly be?
It horrified the purists. None of us at the venues were very happy about it. But what it did, it put Northern Soul on the music map for the industry.
When Granada Television broadcast a documentary about Wigan Casino in 1977, an incredible 20 million British viewers tuned in to discover all about the Northern Soul phenomenon.
If you go to Wigan of a Saturday night, stop there all night, don't come home till 12 o'clock the next day, people think you're crazy or there's something going on there.
They might think wrong thing, like, you know, like a lot of parents think, or stopping out all night, you know, getting up to all sorts.
You're going somewhere where there's a certain good time. Well, it brightens up the people's lives who go.
When the film came out, I think we all had an immense sense of pride. And of course it did attract, as Saturday Night Fever did for disco, a lot more visitors to the casino. So great for the venue. Did it turn people away as well? Maybe felt we'd sold out? To an extent, but I wasn't aware too much of that. It was more inclusive and seen as a good thing at the time.
Norman Jay, a young Londoner, had been avidly reading about the Northern Soul scene in music magazines for years. But he made his very first trip up north the year the Granada film was televised.
On queuing to get into Wigan, I remember we were allowed to jump the queue because when the people in the queue heard us speaking with Cockney accents, they couldn't believe that we'd driven all the way from London to Wigan. And I was really excited, and it was like a football match because I can vividly recall standing across the road outside the main entrance and watching coaches, you know, from Manchester, from Huddersfield, from Leeds, you know, from all parts of Scotland and Bristol. And I'm like, wow.
But just as Northern Soul broke nationwide, the scene was wrestling with its biggest ever dilemma.
I can remember us having conversations in 1975 and actually being worried about, are the records going to dry up? Because we had such an unbelievable run from, let's say, 68 through to 75, where every other week people were discovering records that nobody knew. And we were like, well, sooner or later it's going to dry up, isn't it?
It had to implode at some stage because you can't build a scene on oldies because eventually you'll run out of great songs. That was the inherent problem with Northern Soul. You were relying on finding records that everyone else had forgotten about. Now, there is a finite amount of those records, so inevitably it had to kind of run into a brick wall at some stage.
Blackpool Mecca DJ Ian Levine was now frequently travelling to New York, fascinated by its blossoming disco scene.
The heat and the atmosphere reminded me of the early days of Northern Soul. Everybody was into the music, and it really hit me like a bullet, and it influenced me forever. So, of course, coming back from that, I started to get more disco-fied at the Mecca.
they began to play the more up-tempo disco records that were starting to be made in New York. Now, these records, in a lot of ways, were harking back to the golden era of Tamla Motown in the mid-1960s. They had the horns, they had the strings, they had the lush production that Northern Soul fans loved.
Ian's view was initially to merge the two. You can take it to what he saw as being the logical progression of Northern Soul, which was just great dance music. And that didn't sit well with a lot of guys from some of these small northern towns that didn't want to know what was going on in New York or Philly or Chicago. They were more interested in what had happened there in the 60s.
Over at the Wigan Casino, they also weren't that thrilled about Ian Levine's new disco direction and decided to stick to tradition, playing obscure up-tempo 1960s soul records. But with rarities from that era now drying up, the Wigan Casino would increasingly play anything with a Northern Soul beat.
At Wigan, a general, I would call it a dumbing down, where the beat almost became more important than the actual piece of work itself. So if it had that right sort of on the fours, should we say, beat, it would get played, and certain people weren't too concerned about, was it even a soul record?
You'll always get some people who were saying, why on earth were certain records played? One record called Joe 90 and version of Tony Blackburn's I'll Do Anything. It was just the fact that if a DJ played them and you got a very good reaction to it, you know, he'd probably still keep playing it.
Ross was quite happy to play records that may have been white pop standards. Some abominable records got played. Records that I was very vociferously slagging off at the time, as such, pissing Ross off no end. He didn't like the fact that I was criticising his music, so it got a bit fractious.
The Tony Blackburn record that was getting spins at the Wigan Casino had been originally recorded by Tony back in 1968. He had then completely forgotten about it for years.
I was doing a Radio 1 show and I got this phone call from somebody in the north saying, do you realise that you've got a big Northern Soul hit? And I said, what's it called? They said, I'll Do Anything. I remember saying to them, it's awful. It's absolutely appalling. It was one of the worst records I've ever made. What had happened is somebody got hold of a white label, which was a demo album, and they made it into a single under the name of Lenny Gamble. They didn't want to make it under the name of Tony Blackburn, which would have been a complete disaster. And I said, well, these people in the north in these clubs don't know it's me. They said, no. And they said it was selling like hotcakes. Well, I went there into the Wigan Casino and I mimed to the record and I got a fantastic reaction. And then when I finished doing the song, all these people come up and wanted me to sign my autograph, so I signed Tony Blackburn. And I remember one person saying, would you mind signing Lenny Gamble? And I wasn't aware whether or not they knew it was me or not, Tony Blackburn. So I asked one of them, I said, of course I'll put Lenny Gamble. And I said, you do know it's me, do you, Tony Blackburn? I said, yes, Lenny.
As Blackpool Mecca embraced disco and the Wigan Casino played more and more watered-down 1960s soul stompers, the hostilities between these two citadels of Northern Soul reached a climax.
Where it got ugly was that on a Sunday, we were all on the Ritz in Manchester. The Wigan crowd were all there for Richard and everybody, and they couldn't stand the music I was playing, and they threw things, and people got into fights, and the Mecca crowd couldn't stand the Wigan stompers. Get off, we want Levine on. And they were saying, get off Levine, we want Richard on. And then it became all-out war.
Certainly there was a lot of real passion and anger, I suppose, even. They talk about the north-south split. This was a north-north split.
people at Wigan had Levine Must Go badges, Levine Must Go banners, Levine Must Go T-shirts. That's the worst thing. They actually had Levine Must Go T-shirts, and it was like football fans. It was like Manchester City and Manchester United. Very nasty, very, very ugly, and I'd had enough in the end.
As the Northern Soul scene unravelled, the drugs were also taking their toll.
We lost a couple of our Edinburgh friends through the drugs. In the space of a year, there was probably, you know, maybe 7 or 8. And they were all teenagers or just turning 20 or something. And we were young, and it was heartbreaking. It really was. If there's one bad word said about Northern Soul, then it would be the drug scene.
By the end of the 1970s, the focus on rarity that had made the Northern Soul scene so special had gone.
All the purists hated me because they blamed me for changing the sound. They still wanted to hear 60s stompers. I think I went too far. The more they hated me and the more they dragged on their Levine Must Go campaign, the more determined I was to go in the opposite direction. So we ended up playing Sylvester, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, and records like that, and even some Donna Summer at Blackpool Mecca, which I think was wrong. I think was too commercial. I think by the time we finished, we were playing records that any youth club could play, and there was no elitism anymore.
Ian Levine eventually decided to quit the scene.
I left the Mecca in July of '79, and that was it. I made that horrible statement, Northern Soul is dead, it's gone, which is not true. But, you know, sometimes anger and despair and just an insufferable wall of pain forces you into something you just can't stand anymore. It was horrible.
Just 2 years later, the Wigan Casino was forced to close down to make way for a planned civic centre extension.
I think we can draw a line after Wigan and say that that was the end of the glory years of Northern Soul. A lot of people decided that really, do you know what, that's it for me. There'll never be anything as good as Wigan, so they didn't want to go to a second best alternative. It did feel like there was the end of something very special.
That last night was just absolutely horrible because you thought that was it. You would not see these wonderful people and your friends on a regular basis anymore. The last 3 records at the end of the night, I played them and then everybody just clapped and wouldn't stop clapping. I played them again and they, no, shouting and clapping, they didn't want to go. Played them for the 3rd time and then I'm in tears on stage. A lot of people were as well. Couldn't stay any longer, I was just so upset. Hopped in the car and just drove up to a place, Rivington near Wigan, just looking over the countryside there and broke my heart.
Sometimes I feel I've got to run away, I've got to get away from the pain you drive into the heart of me, the love we share.
Northern Soul went underground again in the 1980s, but it was already providing the source material for huge global pop hits.
I can't sleep at night.
We were looking for a cover version to put in the set, and at the time electronic bands, it was the thing to be very cool and very kind of, you know, very sort of everything was bleak and everything was like this cold sort of northern robotic thing. And Dave Ball suggested to me, what about doing a Northern Soul song? What about this song, Tainted Love? Well, immediately I loved the title because I thought that was what Soft Cell was all about, tainted and love, these 2 words together. Something about the song just hooked me in. Tainted Love brought Northern Soul over to a more mainstream audience.
Northern Soul was also influencing British club culture of the 1980s.
Northern Soul was effectively a template for what happened in 1988 with the acid house explosion. It was basically loads of working class kids dancing in basements to black American music, hopped up on pills.
These events would take place on an ad hoc basis. There was a word of mouth, underground, the linkage between drugs, the need to stay up late, the fast music, the obscurity of it all.
There was an edginess to Northern Soul in the same way that there was with Acid House. There were so many people that had progressed from the Northern Soul scene onto the early house scene that the parallels are just really blindingly obvious.
Northern Soul today is alive and well, and one of the reasons why it's such an endearing legacy is that new younger kids are discovering it. Elements of Northern Soul are manifesting themselves, you know, in loads of current pop tracks. I mean, you only have to listen to Pharrell Williams' Happy. That's where Northern Soul is today. There's a direct correlation between that and music of the 60s and 70s.
If you listen to Happy, I mean, that is straight four on the floor. It's got all those elements that we wanted for Northern Soul.
Elaine Constantine fell in love with Northern Soul as a teenager in Lancashire. Today, she has channeled her passion into a movie set amongst the anarchic lives of clubbers in the north of England.
They had passions and they were driven and they were intelligent and they were sharp. And they lived a full life, you know, they lived life to the max.
I love my baby's specialty, and just told her I didn't know her love was that strong.
Someone watches that film, that's what I want them to get out of it, that they, you know, that it is a very cool thing.
As well as inspiring contemporary music and movies, Northern Soul is attracting a whole new generation. Today, the scene is in a very vibrant state.
Younger people coming onto the scene could not have a better situation because we've sifted out the trash. There is no Wigan's ovation. We've sorted it all out. So you come to one of our venues, it's the best of the Wheel, the best of Blackpool Mecca, it's the best of the Torch, the best of Wigan, and the best of today.
I've always said I never want to see it decrepit to the stage where it's a bunch of 70-year-old men in Zimmer frames trying to dance to the lost values of their youth. Northern Soul was cool, hip and fresh. It was smart kids in Ben Shermans and Brute aftershaves spinning round and clapping their hands on the beat and looking sharp and attractive. That's what it was. And thank God there's a whole new crowd, not just in England, but in Japan and in Sweden and in Austria, all over the world. There's even Northern Soul nights in San Francisco. It's fantastic.
It's fresh, it's young, it's vibrant, and it needs today's kids to re-establish it again and take it into the future.
Every day in the bright sunshine. The bright sunshine. It's the same old story all over the world. Girl needs boy and boy needs girl. So be young, be foolish, but be happy.